Hello! Today I'm looking at among the most nostalgic elements of latter 90s Final Fantasy games, pre-rendered backgrounds. Now, jumping right in, pre-rendered backgrounds aren't something that were unique to the Final Fantasy series, nor were they even particularly prolific across Final Fantasy games if we take into account the entire oeuvre of the series. And indeed, despite their renown, pre-rendered backdrops in Final Fantasy games account for only a fleeting window of time between about 1997 to the year 2000, where they hallmarked the aesthetic and the environments of Final Fantasy VII, Final Fantasy VIII, and Final Fantasy IX, and to a lesser extent, many argue Final Fantasy X as well. And Final Fantasy VII, as I've recently discussed, was momentous in many ways, not least in how it broke away from the prevailing RPG trope of top-down pixel tilesets forming the game worlds and the environments, which had persisted from Final Fantasy I, and indeed before this in pioneering JRPGs such as Dragon Quest in 1986, Dragon Slayer in 1984, and so on and so forth, back to their origins. So Final Fantasy VII, as I say, was quite an important turning point, not least for moving away from that convention. Now, looking to what succeeded pre-rendered backgrounds, we need only look at Final Fantasy X, which by the PlayStation 2 era was capable of confidently utilising 3D environment design and rendering, and thus cinematic crops, camera angles and camera movements worked to bring the game experience to life. And while many initially critiqued the linear environments and the perpetual field screen that made up the Final Fantasy X experience, what's often less commented on is how these beautiful environments were tilted and panned around with a 3D camera and were able to do so much more since Final Fantasy had moved into the realms of 3D. So that's what came before and since, but let's turn now to pre-rendered backgrounds and we'll look at some examples of Final Fantasy within Final Fantasy and also the impetus behind them and why they worked so well. And jumping right in, first and foremost, moving into the advanced 5th generation console cycle, and more particularly the Sony PlayStation, which had its CD technology, the Square team were able to effectively elevate Final Fantasy from the top-down pixel art of days gone by, which was very flat and beholden to a single perspective, and they moved this over into polygonal 3D, which permitted not only more dynamic camera angles and perspectives, but also a higher fidelity of detail and depth to the environments that were being created, which contributed hugely to the sense of atmosphere and mood. And indeed, where I've argued in the past that the introduction of voice acting removed some of the onus on the music to create a certain mood or theme or attitude around a character, we could also argue the same thing of the shift into pre-rendered backgrounds, because the threatening gloom of a dungeon or the wistful rustic vibes of a rural village was now capable of being rendered visually with so much clarity that it wasn't entirely all on the music to communicate this sense of whatever that environment might be about. Although, of course, it is a highly complementary dynamic between the backdrops and the music score. And if we just take a handful of examples, Cosmo Canyon in Final Fantasy VII, or Balam Garden in Final Fantasy VIII, or the village of Dali in Final Fantasy IX, these iconic locations are synonymous not only with their particular visual design and the aesthetic of the pre-rendered backdrop, but also their music score too. And these respective elements, I think, really go hand in hand in creating that memorable experience for which the latter 90s Final Fantasy games are so highly renowned. Now, since they were first utilised in the industry, fans have been enamoured with the construction and the particular design of pre-rendered backgrounds, because looked at, particularly today, where for the most part players can only really play in them in these haphazardly upscaled versions that have been ported over to PC and so on, from this original kind of 4:3 aspect ratio. While they are clearly flat layers that have been appended as a backdrop to the field screen, they used various simple techniques to bring themselves to life and elevate the world a little bit more. And indeed, much like the early diorama exhibitions, which were popularised in 19th century France and were used to elevate the experience of the gallery and painting through the use of lighting techniques, layering and perspective. Final Fantasy and the pre-rendered backgrounds use very much a similar sort of thing to make them feel a little bit more tangible and like we're operating in a living world. So a straightforward example would be the use of parallax layering to craft a sense of depth in the scenes. And what I mean by this is, rather than simply having a background layer that our characters run around on top of, images are also layered into midground, foreground, and so on top of our protagonists to give the illusion that they are sitting within an environment. We see Cloud running behind buildings, for example, or elements that are much closer to the camera to give that sense of depth. With regards to parallaxing, this is a subtle piece of camera work wherein, as the camera moves around, following the player character in the foreground, elements of the farthest background, and sometimes also the midground as well, such as a skyline or a distant landscape, will move on a separate layer at a separate speed, which again gives that illusion of scope and depth and distance. Another aspect of pre-rendered backgrounds that is intriguing, particularly looking at Final Fantasy games, is their small but considered use of animated elements. And what this does is reduce that sense that something is static and lifeless. And it's not dissimilar, I suppose, to Japanese anime. And one thing you may note if you watch anime, and particularly the older stuff that was entirely hand-drawn, is that they often use static character drawings and looping character drawings where possible to cut down on their need to draw excessively for these fast frame rates. So a classic example of a scenario would be an anime character who is deep in thought. So maybe in this instance the drawing of the character is completely static, but to give that sense of life, maybe there's clouds rolling past in the background, or the camera is slowly zooming in on them with the voiceover going over the top. And what this does is it creates that sense of life and movement in the scene in a very sort of low effort way, but really works effectively, rather than just simply showing a static drawing being displayed. And Final Fantasy, I think, does a similar thing with its pre-rendered locations where, for example, upon arriving at Nibelheim in Final Fantasy VII, which in the contemporary events of the game is quite a ghostly, desolate place without much movement or NPCs to interact with, what we have introduced to the pre-rendered background is the solitary spinning windmill on top of the fountain, which almost exacerbates that sense of isolation in the town, and I think is heightened by the fact that the windmill movement is reflected in the shadow on the ground too. So it's a great little detail, and stuff like this appears in hundreds of these pre-rendered backgrounds across Final Fantasy VII, VIII and IX that worked really well towards bringing the environments to life. Now, a couple more points to cover in this overview, which is just designed as a top-level intro, but one thing that's always struck me, and I think isn't perhaps obvious since the pre-rendered backgrounds do appear very, if not static, then painterly for the most part, almost as if they'd hang in a gallery space rather than be the product of technology. But what's fascinating about them is they are indeed adapted from concept art and rendered into CG imagery before being compressed and layered down and deployed into the game build. And some of the seamlessness and utilisation of the CG artwork comes across really beautifully in how it seamlessly transitions into FMV sequences. And I've noted this most recently in Final Fantasy VII because I'm playing that at the moment. But we have moments like where the camera tilts up to view the Shinra building right at the beginning of the game while we are controlling Cloud Strife and just about to enter the reactor. We also have moments like the zoom into the northern crater after we scale up Gaia's cliff. And we have pivotal moments in the plot and the story, such as Barrett opening the blinds in the Junon base, which climactically reveals Meteor and the sky having turned red in the mid-stages of the game. And also we have Red 13, and when he gazes upon the statue of Sato, his father, and we go from the pre-rendered background into the FMV sequence, where we zoom in on the petrified Seto. Great examples of how the pre-rendered artwork and the FMV stuff really interact and work seamlessly together to create some quite momentous and iconic cinematics within the game world. And just off the top of my head, while I remember, a big shout out to the Battle of the Gardens sequence of Final Fantasy VIII, which is among my favourite scenes in Final Fantasy of all time, particularly in the way that it blends the player control and the player avatar of Squall, and it blends it in with the pre-rendered backdrops and an action-packed FMV sequence going on in the background. And I think I will dedicate a future episode to break down and really talk about some specific examples of pre-rendered backgrounds and FMVs in the not too distant future. So, moving on finally, the short-lived and swift decline of the pre-rendered backgrounds owed to their inherent limitations, which many might argue are their strengths, but it was this combined with the rapid pace of technology, and it saw pre-rendered backgrounds in everything from Abe's Odyssey and Grim Fandango and Final Fantasy, all of these hallmark games of the mid to late 90s, and it was phased out pretty quickly, and by the turn of the millennium, or shortly thereafter, they were kind of scarcely seen, particularly in big AAA games. And the reason for this, or at least one of the reasons for this, is that the inherent stasis of the artwork and being beholden to a fixed camera angle per screen, which, while it worked wonders for games like Resident Evil, where the fixed and often awkward or claustrophobic camera angles increased the sense of dread that was inherent to those games, particularly when you can hear something before you can see it, which was terrifying at the time. All this static viewport gameplay was pretty much phased out by the time the PlayStation 2 rolled around, because we were able in future to pivot and control the 3D cameras in the games. So where we had this in early titles like Croc or Tomb Raider, in quite straightforward, sparsely populated 3D games, this was rolled out more broadly and was now being used in more developed games, where the right analog stick or the shoulder buttons on a console became the means of pivoting the camera around your character. And so by the time Final Fantasy XII rolled around in about 2006, this was pretty much a mainstay of the series. And I suppose the catch-22, if you put them side by side in their original iterations, the 3D environments of Final Fantasy XII were arguably sparser because they were being rendered in real time, as opposed to, the quality that we saw, albeit, scaled right down to 480p at the time, in games like Final Fantasy VIII, Final Fantasy IX. But again, that's something that's discussed and debated to this day. And on that note, finally, as forums and enthusiasts will attest today, along with the revival of some small developers kind of working on RPGs and other stuff, reintroducing pre-rendered backgrounds, I think it's evidence that they do remain pretty well regarded in the popular consciousness, particularly around the Final Fantasy series, which, as I say, had its peak in popularity at a time that coincided of these environment designs being used pretty much exclusively for the field screens, and further attempts at 3D were only used, in battle scenarios, and then later down the line when we got to Final Fantasy X, Final Fantasy XII, and so on. So there we have it, a brief look at pre-rendered backgrounds in the Final Fantasy series. As I say, I may follow up with some more specific examples and breakdowns of my favourites, or where I think these work particularly well in the Final Fantasy games to heighten elements of story or atmosphere. But in the meantime, feel free to drop a comment below, let me know your thoughts on pre-rendered backgrounds, and which stand out among your favourites in the various Final Fantasy games.